Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We're continuing our look at changed dialogue since the rising of the blood moon, and this guy's next.
Ah, your lies spin a web, but I see through your deceit. I did not learn from books. No. I learned it all with my own mind.
So, right off the bat, we're seeing some differences between the literal and the official, but I think you can see how the sense of the original is being preserved. After all, what's the point of this man first telling us not to lie and then going on to say he knows everything? Clearly the idea is that he's so smart he can see through any deception we might try to trick him with. It's also plain that at this point he's starting to slip into madness. In the Japanese, there's a sense of exasperation that I can't help but read into his phrasing, particularly with the extended ah sound in uso tsukunja nai. Considering that this is supposed to be a somewhat crazed take on the sorts of things he's been saying before about us not being able to fool him with our lies, I think the official translation having him go on about how our lies spin a web, but that he can see through our deceit is perfectly fitting. He sounds a bit like he's raving and could be seen as exasperated when relaying the first line, then crazily confident as he delivers the second. That brings us to the third line, which I find particularly interesting because of the way his repeated attempts to begin the final sentence has been rendered into a sequence of no's. Arguably, the result is more natural than having him say, "I did not learn from books. I have," but it still perfectly gets across the idea that he's barely holding it together and struggling to properly articulate his thoughts. Also, speaking of not being able to hold it together, I probably shouldn't have expected to survive that fall. Anyway, another thing worth mentioning about this line is the succinct way the official translation is able to convey the idea of institutionalized learning in the Japanese. In the original, the kanji being used for the word gaku makes it clear that the type of learning this man lacks is the type that's taught in a school-like setting, meant to be presented by a teacher or studied in an organized fashion. This is why my more literal version uses the phrase school learning, but here the official version goes for the more natural sounding, "I did not learn from books," while arguably bringing to mind the idea of book learning. But for all that the first three lines of this short dialogue have a lot going on, the final line is perhaps the most interesting, because if you look at my more literal version of "I have special knowledge," you might draw a connection to an item like madman's knowledge. Is this narrow-minded man claiming to have a special insight that lets him see the truth despite our lies? Well, he might think so, but I don't think the game wants us to believe he's right. None of his tips have proven to be especially worthwhile so far, and his contrary approach to our advice means that if we had been honest and told him to go to Erden Chapel for safety, he would have met a very different fate. Also, in a more linguistic sense, it's worth noting that since the madman's knowledge item uses an unusual set of kanji for the term knowledge, there's no direct link to that item or any other that provides insight. I think it's perfectly reasonable to take away from this line the natural follow-up to the idea conveyed by the one before it. In other words, he's saying that while he might not have any institutional learning, he's got a natural gift for knowing what's up. Having said that, it is true that in the Japanese, the term used for madman's knowledge, chie, has the same reading as the one used in this dialogue, so I could also see an argument being made that this is meant to come across as misleading to the player. Perhaps the final line could have been something like, "I let my insight guide me." Personally, I think the official translation fits this character and the moment better, but I did want to acknowledge that the line could be taken another way. Anyway, how are you doing?
A celebration. A great night of celebration.
You know, that's probably about as well as could be expected. As far as the translation goes, once you discount the crazy laughter, there's really only one new line here, but it does involve an interesting kanji usage that's tricky to translate. Kind of like we saw with the unusual characters for knowledge in Madman's Knowledge, there's a relatively common word being used with the less common Japanese character. That word is matsuri, which when it's preceded by the honorific o and written with its most common kanji, is typically translated as festival. However, in this instance, an older kanji is being used, one with particular overtones of enshrinement. In other words, there's a sense here that this person is saying that this is a night of either worshipping the divine or of sanctification, and this nuance is the result of a familiar word represented in an unusual form. It's this latter sense, that of something close to what's expected but also different, that I've tried to replicate in my own literal translation, using commemoration instead of celebration. But the word celebration does have its advantages, since it similarly has an association with both revelry and worship. Just look at the example sentence for Merriam-Webster's first sense of the word celebrate, a priest celebrates Mass, and I think you can see the religious aspects of the word clearly. Celebration, then, does a good job of mirroring the Japanese term. It may not have the same effect of striking a player as at once familiar but archaic and slightly different, but it does preserve the meaning. For this reason, I think celebration is ultimately the best choice, but having seen the Japanese does give me a new appreciation for what's being said, since the themes of worship and deification are that much more apparent. I also think it's interesting to have this sort of nuance in otherwise innocuous speech. Obviously, the individual delivering these lines doesn't know about the mensis ritual, they're basically the ravings of a drunk. Still, I wonder if this is meant to be a sort of unconscious clue about what's going on, as you might expect from Lovecraftian fiction. Whatever the case may be, though, I think it's time we moved on to another set of items from Cainhurst. Cain Helm, a silver helmet used by the Knights of the Royal Guard who protect Annalise, Cainhurst's Queen of Blood. Extremely thin, this cloth-like armor of silver is said to repel malicious blood, and they, the Knights of the Royal Guard, rely on it as they become hunters of blood for their queen, so that someday she may hold a child of blood in her arms. Now, I imagine some of the phrasings used here are beginning to sound familiar, so let's start off by acknowledging how some parts of this description line up with what we've seen before. First of all, right in the name of this set of attire, we're once again seeing the shortened version of the word Cainhurst in the Japanese. As discussed in relation to the Cainhurst badge back in episode 44 of Translationborne, this seems to be a move towards unifying terminology related to Cainhurst, as well as perhaps an attempt to discourage associations from outside the game. There's also another instance of what seems to be unified terminology right in the first set of lines. As we saw just last episode with the Chikage, there's that phrase I've literally rendered Cainhurst's Queen of Blood, which the official translation interprets as Queen of the Vile Bloods at Cainhurst Castle. This also came up back in episode 44, and I'll reiterate first that this phrase could be interpreted as Queen of the Blood of Cainhurst, and second, that we're still missing some important evidence as to why I think Queen of Blood is a better choice. Of course, in both of these instances, it's also possible that the Japanese text was updated after the official English text was locked in, though I think the repeated phrase where that explanation is most likely to apply is the one at the very end of this item description. In the official English, this is the part of the line that's been rendered, so that one day she may bear a child of blood. Here the relevant portion of the Japanese, Chi no Wakago wo Daku, was one we've seen before on the Blood Rapture rune, only there it was translated carrier of the child of blood. You may recall how back in episode 41 of Translationborne I went through the various definitions of daku and idaku to show that while technically this is a phrase that could be translated bearer of the child of blood, doing so might be misleading because daku in Japanese doesn't imply pregnancy the way the phrase bear a child does in English. Well, here on the Cainhurst set, we're seeing the phrase bear a child of blood rather than carry a child of blood, as it might have been if it were translated to match the phrasing used on the Blood Rapture rune. And in case there were any doubt about the meaning in the Japanese used in the description of the Cainhurst set, it clearly specifies that the goal is for the queen to hold a child of blood in her arms. So while the official English wording of so that one day she may bear a child of blood carries a strong implication of childbirth, a literal rendering of the Japanese, so that someday she may hold a child of blood in her arms, is less direct. This is part of why I suspect there may have been a change to the Japanese text here, especially given the alternative translation in the Blood Rapture rune. But this line is also tied to another piece of text we have linguistic reasons to believe features updated Japanese. Remember that extremely vague note in Bergenworth describing what happens when the red moon hangs low? Well, after it says that the Great One or Great Ones will appear, it concludes, Wareda akago dakan. This is another variation on the Japanese phrase akago daku that we've seen both on the Blood Rapture rune and now on the Cainhurst set, only rather than referring to the queen holding a child of blood, it may well be referring to holding us children or us holding a child. Actually, if we were to take this note as having been penned by a queen, the initial wareda could be taken as an imperious form of the first person, kind of like the royal we in English, and the note could be understood to say, and I will surely hold a child. But however we interpret this note, there does seem to be a deliberate link between the Great One's action once the Red Moon descends and the action the Queen will take with the Child of Blood. And this is precisely the point where we have linguistic evidence to believe the Japanese was updated and other languages were not. Based on Last Protagonist's translation from the Korean, this line seems to have originally been a much more straightforward reference to childbirth. From this, it stands to reason that the Cainhurst set would also originally have involved a straightforward reference to bearing a child that was retained in the English but changed in the Japanese, likely around the same time the Bergenworth note was updated. The result of all this is a confusing set of parallels. In the English, the reference to a womb being blessed with child lines up reasonably well with bearing a child of blood. In the Japanese, the idea of a queen holding a child of blood matches up pretty closely with a Great One descending and a child being held. But while arguably the connection between the phrases exists in both languages, the action involved, childbirth as opposed to an embrace, is different. Still, it's interesting to see just how many things this description is tied to. Already I've referenced the Blood Rapture rune and the Bergenworth note, Cainhurst's Queen of Blood and the mysterious Child of Blood, but there's also a connection to be made to the Cainhurst badge that doesn't come through as strongly in translation, perhaps due to character limitations, with the literal phrase Hunters of Blood, which in turn ties the Royal Guard to the collection of blood dregs. We'll definitely have to revisit all of this information later, but for now, let's turn to something new. Spirit Husk, the husk of a mollusk known to be a portent of the higher rank ones. Many species of mollusk exist, and the Healing Church calls them all spirits. Their husks, particularly those that still have some mucus, also retain some arcane power. By rubbing this, a weapon can be clad in arcane power. Here we're getting a little more information on what's going on with the mollusks, or spirits, that we haven't heard much about since we looked at the Augur of Ebrietas back in episode 29 of Translationborne. Actually, as if to drive home the connection between these two items, the first line in this description makes use of the exact same Japanese phrase to describe what spirits or phantasms are. In the original, the entire phrase is Joisha no sakibure toshite shirareru nantai seibutsu. Literally, this works out to something like molluscal beings known to be portents of higher rank ones, and you can see similar versions of this phrasing in my more literal translations for both this item and the Augur of Ebrietas. By contrast, the official English uses two distinct phrasings. Here on the Empty Phantasm Shell, the wording is empty invertebrate shell that is said to be the familiar of a great one, while on the Augur of Ebrietas, the translation is invertebrates known to be augurs of the great ones. Why are these translations so different? Well, I actually think some, if not all, of these discrepancies can be explained by a combination of context and interpretation. For instance, on the Augur of Ebrietas, this entire phrase is very clearly set off by a comma and then followed by the word seire, meaning spirit or phantasm, so it's clear the entire phrase is meant to be translated as a definition for the following word. The Empty Phantasm Shell makes it less obvious whether this phrase is meant to stand on its own or include the word nukegara, meaning empty shell or husk, and it looks like the translation followed a more inclusive interpretation, which is why in this instance the phrase is translated as empty invertebrate shell that is said to be a familiar of a great one, as opposed to empty shell of an invertebrate, which are known to be augurs of the great ones. What's a little more surprising is the use of the term familiar here on the Empty Phantasm Shell as opposed to augurs on the Augur of Ebrietas, because even in this new context, sakibure is closer to augur or portent than familiar, presumably as in a witch's familiar. What may help to explain this, though, is the usage of the singular that seems to have happened with this shell as opposed to the plural on the Augur of Ebrietas. And this may be the result of the interpretation based on the specific context I just described. Given that the official translation seems to have taken the full Japanese phrase nantai seibutsu no nukegara, or empty invertebrate shell, as the subject of the sentence, of which it's clear there's only one, then how can the singular being that once occupied this shell naturally be described as the portent or augur of what the translation seems to also take as a singular great one? Well, if this is a particular being that always precedes a specific great one, then saying it's that great one's familiar might make sense. If, on the other hand, the initial Japanese phrase had been interpreted as stopping with the word nantai seibutsu before being modified as a whole by no nukegara, so the English language interpretation was empty shell of an invertebrate, which are known to be augurs of the Great Ones, perhaps the switch to the term familiar wouldn't have been seen as necessary. Of course, it's always possible that this is another instance where the Japanese text was updated and originally the term familiar made more sense. If so, this would also explain the change that's taken place in the next sentence, which is that the actors have been flipped around. This may have been done to make the sentence more active, but if so, I wish it had been worded a little differently. By the way, how are you doing out here, old woman? About the same as everyone, then. To get back to the point, though, the official English first makes it sound like the Healing Church has actively discovered a great variety of invertebrates, rather than that a great variety of these invertebrates passively exist, and then implies that the invertebrates are generally known as phantasms, rather than that this is the collective name the Healing Church has given them. The first point I think is pretty minor, but the second could perhaps have been addressed with as simple a change as, the Healing Church has discovered a great variety of invertebrates, or phantasms, as they call the creatures. But again, maybe the Japanese was updated here. Anyway, that's going to do it for this episode, so as always, feel free to leave any feedback you might have, and thanks for watching, everyone.